Good evening. Let the room go quiet around you for a moment, and let the day you have just finished slide off your shoulders like a coat you no longer need to wear. There is a rare kind of person in the long record of the past whose weight is almost too great to hold in the mind all at once. Not the conqueror who took a little more land than the man before him. Not the king whose reign was long and mostly uneventful. Someone else. Someone who stood at a hinge, at a single narrow place where the door of history could still swing either way, and who put a hand against it and pushed. And afterward, everything on one side of that person looks like a different world from everything on the other, and no amount of study will ever make the two halves match. Tonight belongs to one of those figures, a boy born among the wet trees east of a great grey river, in a tribe that built in timber and thatch and had no word for empire. A boy taken south to a city of marble while he was still young enough to be frightened by it. Taught to speak Latin until Latin became the language he thought in. Trained in the drill and the discipline and the tactical grammar of the most effective military machine the ancient world had yet produced. Given Roman citizenship, raised to the rank of Roman knight, which was not a courtesy but a genuine station, a place inside the structure. And then, with all of that carefully installed inside him like a lamp inside a lantern, he turned and used every piece of it to annihilate 3 Roman legions in a wood in the rain. His name was Arminius. Rome believed it had made him one of its own. It was a comfortable belief, and it was entirely reasonable, and it was wrong in a way that cost the empire something close to 20,000 soldiers, 3 sacred eagles of gilded bronze, and the whole future it had been quietly assembling east of the Rhine. The roads half cut through the woodland, the forts standing along the riverbanks with their neat ditches and their palisades, the tax assessors with their wax tablets, the Latin-speaking governors and their courts and their careful clerks. All of that died on a few rainy days in the autumn of the year 9, and none of it ever came back. This is, first, the story of a man who lived between 2 worlds and belonged wholly to neither, and who seems, if you follow what happened to him afterward, never to have made peace with that division inside himself. It is also the story of an empire standing at the very summit of its own self-assurance, so certain of its power and so certain of the superiority of its way of living, that it could not read the plain signs of what was coming until the first spears were already in the air above the track. And it is a story whose consequences did not fade. They ran forward, they are running still, in ways we can follow with unusual precision. Had those days in the forest gone differently, the Rhine would never have hardened into Rome's permanent eastern edge. A Romanized Germany would have grown up instead, speaking a daughter language of Latin, ordered by Roman law, Catholic long before the North turned Catholic, and that country would have become the foundation stone from which the whole medieval European story was built. Everything east of that river is German, because one man decided that it would be. That is the weight of a few grey September days 2,000 years ago. So, dim the lights if they are not already dim. Let your breathing find its slower rhythm. This is a story about forests, and about trust that was given and then broken, and about a man who was 2 things at once and was finally made to choose. You have nowhere to be and nothing to do, and no part of what follows requires anything from you at all. And we begin, strangely, not in the forest. We begin in Rome. Because Rome is where Arminius truly began, and because Rome is precisely what made him the particular kind of danger that Varus, standing in the rain at the head of his column, never saw arriving. The Rome that received him as a child was the Rome of Augustus, the Rome of the peace, the famous Pax Romana, that first and in many ways most extraordinary moment of the long imperial experiment. And you cannot feel the size of the wound in the forest unless you first feel how untroubled Rome was in the year 8 before the Common Era, when a small foreign boy was delivered into the city, and how utterly that untroubled feeling had collapsed by the year 9, when the news came back from the north. The word peace is doing a great deal of quiet work in the phrase Pax Romana, and it covers a reality far more complicated than the word suggests. Yet the reality it covers was, measured against everything that had come before it, genuinely astonishing. Inside the empire's borders, goods travelled long distances in safety along roads that ran without a serious break from the cold hills of Scotland to the banks of the Euphrates. A citizen born in Roman Africa could set out for Gaul or for Syria and cross no border, present no document, pay no duty at any frontier along the way. The law, that Roman law which would sit at the foundation of legal thinking across continental Europe for 2,000 years afterward, offered a shared framework for settling disputes, working with varying completeness from one edge of the world to the other, but working. And everywhere, cities were building. Around the Mediterranean and up through the western provinces, towns were raising forums and amphitheatres, aqueducts stepping across valleys on their high arches, public baths with their hot rooms and their cold plunges, all of it in a recognizable style, so that a man from one province could walk into a town in another and know immediately where he was standing and what it meant. The shared stone was itself a statement. It said, "You belong to this." And what it offered was materially beyond anything the world had managed before. Augustus was the architect of that world, and his method of building was as much a work of illusion as of engineering. He kept the old republican forms standing like a beautiful facade, while the reality behind them was the rule of one man. He was scrupulous about the dignity of the Senate, and equally scrupulous about the Senate's subordination to his will. He turned the army into a professional instrument whose loyalty ran not to an abstract state, but to him personally, by name. None of this was improvised. It was the product of decades of exceptionally patient political arithmetic. He was 67 years old when the Cherusci boy arrived, in the 35th year of his rule, counting from the sea battle at Actium that had ended the civil wars and left him holding the Roman world without a rival. He had been the most powerful man alive for longer than almost anyone in the city could remember any other arrangement existing. To be young in Rome in that year was to have no memory of a Rome that was not his. The empire did not feel like a recent construction. It felt like the natural shape of things, the way the sky is the natural shape of the thing above you. That confidence was not foolish. The armies had been winning steadily for a generation. The campaigns into Germany had unfolded with exactly the methodical competence that Roman planning was supposed to produce. Forts had gone up along the river Lippe. Roads were being cut through the woodland, straight lines opening in a landscape that had never known a straight line. The machinery of administration was being carried north in wagons, piece by piece. From where Rome stood, the land between the Rhine and the Elbe was not a wilderness at all. It was a province in the making, not yet fully organized, not yet fully taxed, not yet stitched into the legal and commercial fabric of the empire, but moving in that direction and moving steadily, the way water finds its level. Octavian, who had taken the name Augustus, the revered one, the consecrated, after the wars that killed the Republic, had already been ruling 2 decades when the boy came south. He had inherited a state exhausted by a century of Romans killing Romans, and he had turned it into the most stable and prosperous political body the Western world had ever seen. His instrument was the Principate, the rule of the first man, the princeps, not king, never king, first citizen. A restoration, he insisted, of the old norms rather than their burial. The fiction was useful, and it was maintained with considerable skill, and it worked well enough that the senators and the great families, who might have been expected to fight the concentration of power into one pair of hands, mostly settled into it instead. The alternative was still too fresh in living memory. They had seen the streets. They preferred the fiction. Augustus was, among his other gifts, a strategic thinker of real ambition. The empire he had assembled from the wreckage was already immense, running from Britain in the northwest to the Euphrates in the east, from the Rhine and the Danube down to the Sahara. But he was not content to keep what he had. He was pushing outward, and the frontier that most interested him from around 12 before the Common Era was the northern one, the line facing the Germanic peoples east of the Rhine, who had been an intermittent problem since the days of Julius Caesar, and whose land Augustus had decided to fold into the empire. The ambition was not madness. The Rhine and Danube line was long, expensive, and awkward to defend, a border that consumed legions simply by existing. The country between the Rhine and the Elbe, which the Romans called Germania Magna, Greater Germany, was populous enough and rich enough in timber and cattle and grain to be worth the trouble of taking. And there was a precedent that seemed to settle the argument. Caesar had conquered Gaul, the land on the western bank, in 8 years of hard and terrible campaigning. And within a single generation, the Gauls had been absorbed with a completeness that startled everyone. Within a century of Caesar's wars, Gallic aristocrats were writing polished Latin and paying for forums in their hometowns. If that could happen in Gaul, the reasoning ran, why not across the river? The campaigns Augustus directed north from 12 before the Common Era were led first by his stepson Drusus, a commander of genuine ability who drove Roman arms as far as the Elbe itself. Drusus died in the year 9 before the Common Era, not in battle, but from a fall from his horse. Historians have never entirely agreed on the details, and the ancient accounts are thin, but the shape of it is grimly ordinary. A broken leg, a long, slow decline in a summer camp, a brother riding hard from Italy to reach him before the end. There is something almost unbearable in it. A man who had marched to the edge of the known world, undone by a stumble in a field. After him came Tiberius, Augustus's other stepson, who took up the work of grinding the tribes into submission with the same unglamorous thoroughness he brought to everything in his life. And by the years we are moving toward, the country between the two rivers was no longer being treated by Rome as a frontier zone to be watched from a distance. It was being treated as a province to be administered. The forts along the Lippe were finished, the roads were being cut. Roman officials were setting up the apparatus that converts conquered ground into a functioning limb of an empire. The tax rolls, the census, the courts, the slow paperwork of belonging. Rome believed it had already won. That belief is the true beginning of the disaster. It matters to understand the physical size of what stood in Germania before that autumn, because what happened there was not the loss of a patrol or the mauling of a border garrison. It was the erasure of a substantial fraction of the entire Roman army. The 3 legions under Varus were the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th. Each was a full-strength formation of roughly 5,000 citizen soldiers, and each dragged behind it the long tail that a Roman army on the move always carried. Auxiliary infantry, drawn from conquered peoples, squadrons of cavalry, engineers, surgeons and orderlies, servants, merchants who followed the silver, families, camp followers, the whole travelling town. Altogether somewhere between 15 and 20,000 human beings, somewhere between 8 and 10% of the empire's entire military establishment, walking in a single line. These were not tired men doing garrison duty in a sleepy province. They were experienced soldiers, many of whom had campaigned on the Danube, commanded by officers of standing, equipped with the full weight of Roman military technology, from the iron-shod javelin that bent on impact so it could not be thrown back, to the surveying instruments that let them lay out a fortified camp on unfamiliar ground before dark. To lose all 3 at once was a catastrophe on a scale Rome had not experienced since Cannae, 2 centuries earlier, when Hannibal had destroyed 8 legions in a single hot afternoon in Apulia. And the man responsible for this one had been a trusted Roman officer only months before. To understand how such a man became possible, you have to understand one of Rome's most consistent habits when dealing with the aristocracies of client peoples and newly swallowed territories. Rome took their children. Not cruelly, not usually, and not as slaves. It took the sons of chiefs and kings as hostages, brought them south and raised them. They were educated. They learned Latin, learned Roman military practice, absorbed Roman values through the pores, and in time they were sent home as adults who would be, it was hoped, thoroughly Roman in outlook, personally invested in Rome's success, and therefore dependable channels between the imperial administration and their own people. It is easy to hear that and think only of the taking, but it was also, in its way, a wager on affection. Rome was betting that if you gave a boy the best years of his life, he would love you for it. The system worked frequently. Many of those children genuinely did become Romans in their hearts. They served the empire's armies and its officers with real commitment, and they became the primary mechanism by which whole societies were drawn, generation by generation, into the Roman way of doing things. The system was one of the quietest and most effective instruments of empire ever devised, and it left almost no monuments. The system also failed occasionally, and the most spectacular failure in the entire history of the Roman Empire was Arminius. He was born around the year 18 before the Common Era, the son of Segima, a chief of the Cherusci. The Cherusci held a stretch of country in what is now northwestern Germany, roughly the land between the Weser and the Aller, a landscape of woodland and open heath and slow brown water. Like every tribe along that shifting frontier, they had spent decades moving back and forth between warfare and accommodation with Rome, sometimes fighting, sometimes trading, sometimes sending men to serve in Roman auxiliary units for pay. Around the year 8 before the Common Era, Segima sent 2 of his sons south, Arminius and his younger brother, whom the Romans would call Flavus, the golden one, for the colour of his hair. Whether this was an act of free choice, or a condition quietly extracted as the price of the tribe's client status, the sources do not make clear, and historians still argue about how much difference the distinction would have made to a father standing in a yard watching his children leave. The practical effect was identical either way. 2 Cherusci boys, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, arrived in the most overwhelming city on the surface of the earth. Try for a moment to stand where they stood. Rome at that time held somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people. We cannot be precise. The ancient figures are unreliable, and the modern estimates depend on assumptions about how many people can be pressed into an insula. But it was certainly larger than anything a child from the northern forests could have constructed in imagination. There was no framework in his head for it. There was no word. The architecture alone would have been a kind of assault. The Forum of Augustus was still under construction then, its great wall of stone rising to shield the city from fire. The Circus Maximus lay in its long valley. The temples and porticos crowded the Capitoline, and everywhere there was the accumulated mass of centuries of building, marble and travertine and brick, painted and gilded and repaired and built over again. For a boy who had grown up among timber longhouses with turf roofs and smoke finding its way out through a hole, there was simply nothing to compare it to. And beyond the stone, the noise. The shouting of the markets, the rumble of delivery carts permitted only after dark, the languages layered on languages, the smell of bread and fish sauce and drains and incense and animals, a city that fed itself by pulling grain across the whole Mediterranean and never once stopped moving. This was the environment in which Arminius spent what were almost certainly the formative years of his life. Not a season, not a visit, years. The years in which a person's sense of what is normal is quietly and permanently set. Noble hostages were treated well, in a particular and limited sense of the word. They were educated, they were housed at a level appropriate to their rank. They were admitted to the social world of the Roman upper class, which meant dinners and conversation, and the slow acquisition of the 1,000 small signals by which that world recognized its own. They learned Latin because there was no alternative. Nobody in that world conducted their affairs in a Germanic tongue, and the ability to speak, read, and write Latin was the price of admission to everything. They learned Roman military thinking as well, partly through direct training and partly through the literary education itself, which was saturated with campaigns and sieges and the analysis of why one commander had failed and another had not. A Roman education was, among other things, a long course in the study of war conducted through the reading of history. And so Arminius was made, in the most deliberate and thorough manner Roman cultural formation could achieve, into a Roman. He did not become merely competent inside that system. He became genuinely good. He served in the auxiliary units, the non-citizen formations that made up an enormous portion of the imperial army, and were drawn from the peoples Rome had conquered or befriended. And he saw hard active service on the Danube during the Illyrian Revolt, which burned from the year 6 to the year 9 of the Common Era, and was one of the most serious military crises of the entire reign. That revolt matters more to this story than its obscurity suggests. The rising in Pannonia and Illyricum required the mobilization of an enormous Roman force and exposed the outer limit of what the empire could manage at once. Augustus is said to have told the Senate that the enemy could be at the gates of Rome within 10 days. It consumed 3 years, and it drained away the attention and the resources that might otherwise have gone into finishing Germany. And then, at last, it ended. In the year 9, the revolt was finally suppressed, and Roman attention swung back toward the north, toward the completion of the German province, at precisely the moment when that attention was about to be aimed at exactly the wrong place. For his service, Arminius was granted Roman citizenship and the rank of eques, a Roman knight. That was not a decoration. It placed him securely within the propertied classes of the empire, a man with standing, a man whose name would be known at dinners. And here we have something rare in ancient history, a description of him written by someone who actually met him. Velleius Paterculus, an officer and later a historian, served in those years and knew Arminius personally. He wrote of a young man of noble birth, brave in action, quick in mind, with an intelligence well beyond what he expected to find in a barbarian. Sit with that phrase for a moment, because it is doing 2 things at once. There is condescension in it, of course, the automatic condescension of a man who assumes the category before he meets the person. But underneath the condescension there is something else, something almost like unease. Velleius was impressed, and what impressed him was not physical courage, which the Romans took for granted in northern men and did not much respect. It was intellect. He had met someone who thought. The man who would destroy Varus's legions was not a howling berserker who got lucky with the weather. He was someone who had outthought the entire Roman imperial system from a position inside it. What turned him? What made a decorated Roman officer decide to become the instrument of Rome's worst military humiliation in 3 centuries? The question sits at the exact center of his story, and the ancient sources circle it without ever landing, partly because they did not know, and partly because the question is harder than it first appears. Begin with the word the Romans used, traitor. That word assumes his first loyalty was to Rome, and that he violated it. And the Romans were not being irrational when they reached for it. Arminius had accepted citizenship. He had held Roman rank. He had served under Roman commanders in Roman operations, and he had taken the operational knowledge that service gave him and turned it into a plan for killing Romans. From the inside of that perspective, it is treachery in the most elemental sense there is. He ate at the table, and then he set fire to the house. But nobody had ever asked him whether he wished to be Roman. He had been taken from his family as a child because his father's tribe had been drawn into the Roman sphere, and noble hostages were the price of admission. The education was given to him. The citizenship was given to him. The rank was given to him. None of it was chosen, certainly not in those first years when every choice was made by adults standing over him. He grew into a Roman in a great many practical senses without ever once being offered the opportunity to decide whether that was what he wanted to be. So the question of what he actually wanted, whether some Cherusci self had survived beneath the Latin all along, patient as a seed under frost, or whether the turning was a slower process that happened only when he came home and saw what was being done there, is genuinely unanswerable. The sources do not resolve it. Historians still debate whether the man who rode north from Rome already knew what he intended, or whether he found out what he intended by watching. There is one piece of evidence that bears on it, and we will come to it properly in its own time, on the banks of a river, with his brother shouting at him from the far side. What matters here is the shape of the argument Arminius made when he made it. He did not say, "I hate Rome because of what Rome did to me." He never framed it personally at all. He spoke instead in the language of principle, of the sacred obligation a man owes to the land of his fathers, of the plain superiority of a life lived under your own laws rather than someone else's. That is the language of a man who has worked out an argument, not merely nursed a grievance. Whatever was happening inside him, he had built a frame for it, and the frame was intellectual before it was emotional. It suggests a person who had thought the thing through carefully, alone, over years, and arrived somewhere. The governance of Varus was, on the available evidence, a serious catalyst. The taxes, the legal impositions, the demands laid on Germanic communities that went well past anything earlier Roman commanders had asked for. Those things created the specific political weather in which resistance became both necessary and organizable. Whether Arminius had always intended to turn and was simply waiting for a moment worth spending, or whether Varus's administration manufactured the moment that converted a loyal officer into a rebel, is another question the sources cannot settle. It may well have been both. A man who had never entirely surrendered his first self, finding in a particular governor's methods a particular and intolerable provocation, and feeling something dormant become active. These possibilities do not exclude one another. He may have carried a primary loyalty to his people that the Roman education overlaid without erasing, like paint over old wood. He may have been radicalized by watching what happened to the tribes under Varus, the taxes assessed, the customary law of the community replaced by unfamiliar Roman procedure, the demands for conscripted men that went beyond anything the tribes had ever agreed to. He may have had ambitions that Roman service could never satisfy, and that leadership of a successful resistance could. He may have loved a woman whose father's politics were pushing him down a road he could not walk. All of these appear in the record to varying degrees, and none of them cancels the others. What is certain is only this. At some point between his return to Germania as a Roman officer and the autumn of the year 9, Arminius made a decision. He would use what Rome had taught him to end Rome's presence in Germany, and he would do it by taking Rome's confident assumptions about him and turning each one, gently, like a key in a lock. The country he came home to was not the uniform howling wilderness that Roman writers like to describe. It was a world organized around principles that were genuinely different from Roman ones, and held together by a religious and cosmological framework that gave the Germanic warrior world its particular texture, and that shaped, afterward, exactly how the victory in the forest was understood and celebrated. Germanic religious practice in the 1st century turned on the sacred grove. Not the temple, the grove. A consecrated stand of woodland, set apart, where the gods were honored with sacrifice, where the community gathered under divine sanction, where the decisions that mattered most were taken and made binding. Tacitus describes these places in his Germania with a mixture of ethnographic care and genuine philosophical respect that shows him at his best as a writer. Spaces in the forest closed to the uninitiated, places where the presence of the divine was felt not through architecture or statuary, but through the character of the space itself, the age of the trees, the dimness of the light beneath the canopy, the particular hush and rustle of a wood in which no ordinary human business is conducted. The gods of the Germans, Tacitus notes, did not dwell in buildings and did not take human shape. Consider what that means for a Roman standing in one. He would have found no image to identify, no altar he recognized, no inscription to read. Only trees and quiet and the sense of having stepped somewhere he was not permitted to be. The Germanic pantheon overlaps only imperfectly with the Roman names the ancient sources reach for. Mercury, says Tacitus, is the supreme god of the Germans, and by Mercury he means the traveller and trickster who moves between worlds, which maps, more or less, onto the figure later known as Odin. Mars they honour above others in war, meaning Teu, the one-handed god of justice and battle, whose name survives quietly in the 3rd day of your week. Hercules was honoured by some, which may be a reference to the thunder god, Thor, whose day sits just 2 days later. But the mapping is inexact and always was. The Germanic religious world had its own texture, its own binding of divine power to the physical landscape, its own understanding of fate as something woven by 3 women at the roots of a tree, its own particular linking of warrior honour, death in battle, and an afterlife in the hall of the war god. Roman categories could not hold any of that. The Romans reached for the nearest name they had, the way travellers always do, and the nearest name was never quite right. This matters because the aftermath of the battle in the forest was a religious event at least as much as a military one. The Roman officers taken alive were sacrificed on altars in the sacred groves. Tacitus reports that tribunals were set up there for pronouncing judgment on prisoners, and that the gallows and the pits were there too, meaning that the killing was organized around ritual, not simply around the practical business of disposing of captives. The captured legionary eagles were carried into the groves and displayed, and this was not gloating. In the theological framework of the time, it was an argument. The victory was understood by Arminius and his warriors as a demonstration of divine favor, as evidence that their gods had proved stronger than the gods of Rome. In a world where every people assumed their fortunes tracked the power of their deities, that was a serious and meaningful claim, and both sides understood it perfectly. The grove was also where the assembly gathered. The Thing, they called it, and the governance of the tribal world ran through these gatherings in a way that gave it a political character quite unlike the Roman Senate or the old assemblies of Athens. The Thing was made up of the free warriors of the tribe. They came armed, and when they approved of what had been proposed, they did not vote, and they did not applaud. They struck their spear shafts against their shields. Hold that sound in your mind for a moment. Hundreds of men in a clearing under old trees, and a single rolling crash of wood on wood and iron on hide, rising and falling as the proposal is put again. There is no Roman equivalent to it. There is nothing in the Senate House that sounds like that. The assembly decided on war and peace. It settled the gravest disputes. It confirmed or rejected the leadership the aristocracy proposed, which meant that no chief, however celebrated, held authority that the free men could not withhold. It was a genuinely participatory institution inside a society that restricted participation to free warrior men, which makes it simultaneously more democratic than the Roman Senate in one direction and more exclusionary in another. Both things are true. Neither cancels the other. Our best single source for all of this is Tacitus's Germania, written around the year 98, nearly a century after the battle, and it is a complicated document to lean on. It is at once a real work of anthropological observation and a political text whose portrait of a simple and virtuous northern people is partly designed to shame the moral softness that Tacitus believed had overtaken his own countrymen. He is holding up a mirror, and he wants his readers to flinch. The Germania is therefore not straightforwardly reliable, and Tacitus almost certainly never set foot in the country he was describing. He worked from the accounts of soldiers and traders who had been there, the way a modern writer works from interviews. But the broad outlines he gives us have been substantially confirmed by archaeology and by comparison with other sources, and they tell us something essential about the world Arminius came home to. The Germanic peoples of the 1st century were not organized into states or kingdoms in any sense a Roman would have recognized. They were organized into tribes, kinship communities ranging from a few thousand people to a few tens of thousands, each governed by an aristocracy of warriors whose authority was partly inherited and partly earned through personal reputation and the demonstrated capacity to attract followers and keep them fed. The chief, and the Latin word translates imperfectly, held real authority that was nonetheless bounded. He was constrained by the assembly, which had to be consulted on anything that mattered. He depended on the continued display of martial virtue, which was the primary currency of standing in a warrior society. Authority was personal, not institutional. It rested on who you were, what you had done, and how many men were willing to stand beside you. It did not rest on an office that carried power, independent of whoever happened to occupy it. That distinction sounds abstract. It was not. It decided everything that followed. Because the Roman provincial system worked by replacing or supplementing local governance with Roman institutions, the governor, the town council, the tax apparatus, the courts, those institutions could be installed with relatively little friction in a society that already had stable urban centres and a literate elite accustomed to bureaucracy, as Gaul had, as Syria had, as North Africa had. There, Roman administration was a new layer over an existing structure, and much of the old structure survived beneath it. In a society organised around kinship and personal warrior authority, the same institutions were not additions, they were replacements. They hollowed out the tribal aristocracy by taking away the very functions that gave that aristocracy its practical meaning. If a Roman court now settles the dispute over the stolen cattle, what precisely is the chief for? If a Roman assessor now determines what a household owes, what remains of the reciprocity that bound a man to his lord? Rome was not merely taxing these people, Rome was dissolving them, and doing it without noticing, because from the Roman side it looked like nothing more than the ordinary paperwork of civilization arriving on schedule. Into this situation, around the year 7, came Publius Quinctilius Varus, appointed governor of Germania, and he deserves a fairer hearing than history has generally been willing to give him. Varus is one of the great scapegoats of the ancient world. The man who lost 3 legions has been blamed for 2,000 years without much effort to understand what he was actually attempting, or to recognize that the choices that destroyed him were not, from inside the situation as he understood it, obviously wrong. He was about 60 when he took the German command, a man of the senatorial class who had climbed the standard ladder of offices and appointments that ambitious Romans climbed, and who had climbed it with notable success. He had been consul in the year 13 before the Common Era, which was a high honour and not given lightly. He had governed Africa and then Syria, both serious appointments in the imperial hierarchy. He was connected to the imperial house through his wife, a grandniece of Augustus. He was, in short, precisely the sort of man who received important provincial commands in the early Principate, politically dependable, administratively experienced, well married. What he was not, and here the sources are clear even if they are unfair about what it implies, was a military specialist. He was a governor, an administrator, a legal authority and a manager of revenue. He had served in military contexts, and there is no evidence at all that he was personally a coward. But the intellectual formation of a governor is different from the intellectual formation of a general, and in Germania in the year 9, that difference killed him and everyone who marched behind him. In Syria it would not have mattered. Syria had cities and courts and a tax base that had been paying somebody for 1,000 years. Syria required exactly the skills he had. The tragedy is that he was given the wrong province, and that nobody in Rome could see it was the wrong province, because in Rome the map already showed Germania in the same colour as everywhere else. His specific mistake was not that he trusted Arminius. Trusting an experienced Roman officer of equestrian rank, decorated for service in the Illyrian revolt, and the son of a Cherusci chief allied to Rome, was an entirely reasonable default. And the warnings he received, when they came, arrived wrapped inside a factional quarrel among Cherusci nobles, which made them look a great deal like manoeuvring and very little like military intelligence. Any governor of any province in any century has received warnings that turned out to be somebody's cousin settling a score. His specific mistake was that he marched an army in column through country he did not know well, without the cavalry screen and the forward reconnaissance that any movement through contested territory requires. He treated a march from one part of a province to another as an administrative relocation, rather than as a military operation through ground that might be hostile. That distinction is the whole battle in a single sentence. Roman army columns on the march were not combat formations. They were long, vulnerable trains of soldiers and pack animals, and wagons and civilians, stretched for miles along whatever track existed, and they could not easily deploy into fighting order in woodland, even with ample warning. In the forest, without warning, they had no chance whatsoever. The Roman soldiers' terrible effectiveness lived entirely in formation, and formation needs space and sight lines and firm ground and a moment to form. Take away any one of those and he is simply a tired man carrying too much weight. Velleius Paterculus, who knew Varus personally and gives us our earliest surviving account, is critical of him in a way that carries the unmistakable flavour of personal frustration. A man of mild character and quiet disposition, he writes, more accustomed to the work of the camp than to the field, and not indifferent to money, as his conduct in Syria had made clear. That last remark suggests Velleius believed Varus had made himself unpopular through financial extraction, and the record of his Syrian governorship does contain some controversy about his fiscal methods. But Velleius is also writing with the full advantage of hindsight, and his catalogue of Varus's deficiencies reads oddly. Half of it is a list of the very qualities that made him suitable for the appointment before the disaster. The other half is a list of reasons why the disaster was not entirely Rome's fault. Both halves were written after everyone was already dead. The deeper problem was never Varus. The deeper problem was the mismatch between the administrative task Rome had assigned itself in Germany, which was to convert the country into a province, and the military reality on the ground, which was that Germanic resistance could not be suppressed by the forces available if it were ever properly organized. Arminius's genius was to organize it before the administrative project could advance far enough to make organizing impossible. A more militarily alert governor might well have detected and deflected the particular ambush of that particular autumn, but the underlying condition that Rome was attempting to Romanize Germania faster than its military position could support would have remained, waiting for another year and another opportunity. Varus was not incompetent in the sense of being unintelligent or ignorant of Roman practice. He had governed Syria, one of the empire's most complex and valuable possessions, and he had governed it effectively. But his Syrian experience may itself have been the trap. He arrived in the north carrying the assumptions of a man who had worked in a province with deep urban traditions, literate elites, and established commercial networks, and he applied those assumptions to a society where not one of those preconditions existed. He taxed the Germanic communities in the manner of a Roman province, which required the assessment of property and income in an economy organized around cattle and grain, and obligations of labour rather than coin. The tribes found the process alien in principle and burdensome in practice. Imagine a man arriving in your yard to count your animals and write the number down, and being told that the number is now the basis of a debt you did not agree to. He adjudicated disputes between tribesmen under Roman legal procedure rather than through the customary law that the communities regarded as the only legitimate way to settle a quarrel. He demanded military service and logistical support beyond anything the earlier client relationships had required. Velleius, critical without being entirely fair, says that Varus imagined he could hold the Germans by the force of law, that he thought they could be governed as a provincial population already accustomed to Roman authority, rather than as a warrior society standing in the middle of a conquest that was still, in every meaningful sense, unfinished. The particular grievance that moved Arminius and his allies to act was, according to the sources, exactly this: the fiscal and legal imposition, the extension of Roman jurisdiction into country where Rome's presence was not yet strong enough to enforce it if the extension were refused. Rome was attempting to govern a territory it had not yet finished conquering, and the warriors who resisted could not easily be crushed, because the forces required to crush them were the same forces already stretched across an enormous frontier. Arminius saw the vulnerability with complete clarity, and he began, quietly, to organize. The coalition he assembled in the months before the battle was an achievement of diplomacy that his Roman training had, with real irony, made possible. He understood something a purely Germanic leader might never have grasped, that the tribes would need to coordinate more tightly than their ordinary patterns of alliance allowed, that the timing and the ground of the ambush would have to be chosen with a tactical precision the northern world was not accustomed to applying to anything, and that the opening move, the deception that would draw Varus onto the road, had to be plausible enough to satisfy a Roman governor who had every reason in the world to be careful. He had learned all of that in Roman service. He had learned it by watching Romans do it to other people. Before we follow him into the trees, it is worth pausing to understand precisely what he was preparing to destroy. What a Roman legion actually was, what the eagle meant, and why the loss of 3 of them was a wound that the Roman state kept touching for generations, the way a person keeps touching a scar. A legion at full strength in the early empire numbered around 5,000 citizen soldiers, arranged in 10 cohorts of roughly 500 men, with the first cohort somewhat larger and treated as the elite formation. Each cohort was divided into centuries, which, despite the name, did not contain 100 men but 80. The word had simply outlived the arithmetic, the way words do. Each century was commanded by a centurion, and the centurions were the professional spine of the entire Roman military system. Experienced soldiers promoted out of the ranks on the basis of demonstrated ability. They knew every man under them by name. They drilled them, trained them, punished them, and sometimes led them personally into contact, accepting a directness of risk that the aristocratic officers above them could choose to avoid, and frequently did. The centurion was the institutional memory of a legion. He was the man who knew how it had always been done, who held standards steady across the endless rotation of well-born young officers passing through on their way to political careers. Take the centurions out of a legion, and what remains is 5,000 men who have forgotten how to be a legion. And then the eagle, the aquila, a gilded or bronze bird mounted on a pole, carried into battle by a specialist standard-bearer called the aquilifer, and it was not a symbol in the modern, weightless sense of that word. It was the most sacred object the legion owned. It was the physical embodiment of the unit's honor and its collective identity, associated in Roman military religion with Jupiter, best and greatest, whose bird the eagle was. A legion that lost its eagle had lost its soul. This was not embarrassment. It was religious catastrophe, a desecration that demanded atonement, either through the recovery of the standard or through the destruction of whoever held it. The eagle was kept in a shrine in the legion's camp. It was anointed on festival days. Men died in appalling numbers to keep it from falling, and everyone in the army understood exactly why. 3 of them were taken in that forest, and they stood in Germanic sacred groves for decades afterward, and the Roman obsession with getting them back was genuine, and it never entirely cooled. The campaigns that Germanicus led between the years 14 and 16 were justified to Tiberius and to the Roman public, partly on those grounds alone. The eagles must come home. 2 of them did, in those campaigns. The third was not recovered until the reign of Claudius, 32 years after the battle, by which time almost every man who had marched with them was dead. The number 3 matters in a more arithmetical way as well. The Roman army in that period maintained somewhere between 28 and 30 legions in total, the exact figure drifting with circumstance, distributed across the frontiers in a deployment designed to provide depth. 3 legions was therefore about 1/10 of the entire army, and on the Rhine specifically, it was the substantial share of the river garrison that had been consolidated under one command for the German project. When they died, the Rhine frontier was momentarily stripped of the capacity to resist any serious incursion. Tiberius's emergency deployment north in the autumn of that year was aimed at exactly that, preventing a catastrophic situation in the forests from becoming a catastrophic situation on the Gallic bank of the river, where there were cities and roads and nothing much in the way to stop anyone, and the loss could not be quickly repaired. The Roman military was expensive to maintain and slow to expand. Legions were not raised from levies of farmers who could be made useful in a season. They were professional bodies whose effectiveness came from years of individual training and, more importantly, from unit cohesion, from men knowing without being told what the man beside them would do. The loss of 17 or 20,000 soldiers was a manpower loss the empire could make good over time. Rome had people. The loss of 3 formed, cohesive, professionally drilled units, with all their accumulated institutional knowledge and their particular identities, was a different order of loss entirely. And Augustus understood the difference. His decision never again to use the numbers 17, 18, and 19 was a recognition that these things could not simply be rebuilt. The organizations destroyed in the forest were gone. To hand their names to new formations would have been a lie about continuity. So the numbers were retired and left blank in the roster. 3 small silences in a long official list. And they stayed blank for the rest of Roman history. Not every Cherusci noble wanted what Arminius wanted, and the opposition inside his own tribe is worth understanding, because it explains why the ambush had to happen when it did, and in the way it did. He was not the only man of influence among his people, and not all of his peers agreed that resistance was preferable to accommodation. His own father-in-law, Segestes, was deeply and openly pro-Roman. He had prospered under Roman patronage. He believed sincerely that the interests of the Cherusci lay in cooperation with the empire, and there is every indication that he genuinely tried to warn Varus that a conspiracy was being assembled. Varus did not believe him, partly because Varus trusted Arminius, and partly because the warning could be read as a move in the internal factional politics of a tribe whose quarrels Romans found tedious and difficult to follow. It arrived as gossip rather than as intelligence, and it was filed accordingly. The relationship between the two men had also been poisoned by a matter that the ancient sources treat with the discretion of writers who understood that the personal and the political are not separable. Arminius was in love with Segestes' daughter, Thusnelda. Segestes opposed the match, apparently on the grounds of Arminius's treasonous intentions, which, if true, means Segestes knew about the plan before the battle, or possibly on more ordinary grounds of family politics and pride. Historians still argue about which, and the honest answer is that a father may hold several reasons at once and not be able to separate them himself. Arminius eloped with her. He took her without her father's formal consent, which, in Germanic custom, was technically an abduction, a serious breach of the norms governing marriage and family honour. The marriage happened regardless. Segestes went to Varus and warned him again, more urgently. Varus dismissed him again. Picture the old man walking out of the Roman headquarters for the second time, past the sentries, into the wet afternoon, knowing exactly what is coming and having no remaining way to say it. The deception Arminius used was calibrated with beautiful precision to Varus's own understanding of his position. Varus commanded a large army in a territory being treated as pacified. The forts were built, the administration was functioning, the tribes appeared to be cooperating. So when Arminius brought him word of a minor rising somewhere in the interior that needed putting down, Varus responded as a governor handling a routine security matter, not as a commander operating in contested ground. That was the entire trick. Not a forged letter, not a poisoned cup. Simply a piece of ordinary bad news, delivered by a trusted officer that made the wrong road look like the reasonable one. He marched his 3 legions out of their summer encampment on the Weser, with the auxiliaries and the cavalry and the full baggage train of an army on campaign, toward the reported trouble, taking a route through the forest that Arminius had recommended. He was walking into something that had been prepared for him with weeks of patient work. The country the column moved into that September was exactly the kind of terrain Roman doctrine feared most and was least equipped to handle. Everything that made Roman armies devastating in the open, the disciplined formation, the interlocking shields, the trained tactical responses executed on command, depended on 3 things: the ability to hold formation, the ability to see the enemy, and the ability to move together in answer to a threat. In deep woodland, in rain, on a narrow track, none of the 3 was available. The trees closed in around the column and cut visibility to a few dozen paces in any direction. The path narrowed until an army stretching for miles, including all its wagons and its non-combatants, could move only in a thin thread rather than in the broad front that would have allowed any kind of response. And it had been raining for days. The forest floor had turned to mud that took the boot and held it. Footing was uncertain. Equipment soaked through and grew heavy. Shields swelled with water and became weights. Any bowstring in that column was useless, and had been for hours. The Germanic warriors had spent weeks moving into position around the chosen ground, and they knew every tree and every fold of it. Along the ridgeline of a long hill above the narrow corridor, they had built earthworks, a rampart of earth and timber running above the place where the column would have to pass. From behind it, they could pour missiles down onto the track, drive into the flank, and vanish back into the trees before any Roman could form up to answer. They had chosen ground that erased every Roman advantage and multiplied every one of their own. Their knowledge of the land, their ability to fight effectively as individuals and in small bands in woodland, their long spears, their particular style of sudden shock combat designed for precisely these conditions. It began somewhere in the vicinity of what is now called Kalkriese, near Osnabrück in Lower Saxony, though the exact location stayed uncertain for the better part of 2,000 years, and has only in our own lifetimes begun to be established. But before we follow the days of killing, it is worth stopping to consider the experience from inside the column, because this is a story the survivors told for the rest of their lives, and the Roman tradition preserved it with an emotional intensity that tells you a great deal about how the catastrophe was felt, and not merely how it was recorded. The legionary walking that track was a professional. He had signed for 25 years. He had drilled endlessly in the formations and the responses that made Roman infantry what it was. He had perhaps seen real fighting in the Illyrian revolt or on some other frontier. He knew what a battle was supposed to feel like. Nothing about that day resembled it. Battles in Roman experience had a shape. You marched to a field, you deployed, you fought in the formation you had trained in, beside men you knew, hearing orders you understood. You won or you lost, but either way you did it as a unit, with a command structure responding to a situation that everybody could at least partly see. What was happening in that forest was none of these things. Attackers appeared from nowhere and were gone again before a shield could come up. The column could not deploy, the trees were too close, the track too narrow, the ground too broken. Orders were almost impossible to pass along a line that stretched for miles. The men near the front had no idea what was happening at the rear. The men at the rear had no idea what was happening at the front. Somewhere in the middle, men heard shouting ahead of them and could not tell whether it was moving closer. The rain did not stop. Equipment that depended on dryness failed. Shields grew heavier by the hour. The mud made it nearly impossible to hold the interlocked shield wall that was the formation's primary defense, on a narrow track where there was no room to lock anything anyway. And the cavalry horses, terrified by the noise and the closeness of the trees and the shouting of warriors they could not see, became difficult to control and could not be usefully deployed in country where they could not turn. The first night, in the camp Varus managed to establish after the first day's attacks, would have been an experience of sustained and grinding dread. The Romans built marching camps as a matter of unbreakable procedure, even under the worst conditions. Ditch, rampart, palisade, laid out to a standard plan so that a man could find the headquarters tent in the dark, in a place he had never been. There is something almost touching in it, the ordinary discipline holding while everything else came apart. Thousands of exhausted men digging in the rain, because that is what one did. The warriors did not press their assault through the darkness, but they were still out there, and every man behind that rampart knew it. The sounds of a forest at night are not quiet. Every creak of a branch, every animal moving in the undergrowth, every shift of wind through wet leaves would have been indistinguishable from warriors taking up position. Men who had fought all day, who were soaked and hungry and beyond tiredness, lay listening to a darkness that might have been full of enemies and could not tell and could not sleep and had to march again at dawn. The survivors who lived to tell the story described that night, years later, as one of the longest and most terrifying of their lives. And they had by then seen a great many nights. The second day was worse. The column tried to move and was attacked again. The baggage train, an enormous mass of wagons and pack animals and civilians, was set on fire either by the warriors or by the Romans themselves to free up movement. Nobody is certain which, and it may have been both in different places. Either way, the smoke rose above the canopy and was visible for miles, announcing to every tribe in the region that the Roman army was in catastrophic trouble and that anyone who wanted a share should come now. Some officers, understanding what was happening, tried to cut their way clear of the column and escape. Most were killed. Some cavalry units apparently did break free, and their escape only deepened the despair of those left behind, who watched the horsemen who were supposed to protect their flanks simply disappear between the trees and not come back. Varus died on the third or fourth day. The accounts are not entirely consistent. Velleius says he was wounded and took his own life with his own sword rather than be captured, and that version became the canonical one in the Roman tradition, framing his death as the last act of a man who understood that capture would have been a worse humiliation still. Whether that is precisely what happened, or whether it was simply the story that best served the purpose of explaining a catastrophic failure without laying the entire blame on a dead man, is something historians still debate and probably always will. The basic fact is not disputed. Varus died in the forest, and with his death, the command structure of 3 legions came apart entirely. What followed was not a battle, It was a massacre. The warriors moved through the trees, killing the scattered, leaderless, exhausted remnants of what had been an army that morning. Some Romans tried to surrender. There is evidence in both the written sources and in the ground itself that prisoners were taken and afterwards sacrificed to the gods of the groves. The treatment of the officers in particular was recorded by Germanicus's men when they found the place 6 years later. Skulls fixed to tree trunks, bones lying where men had fallen, some running, some standing. The remains of altars where the priests had performed the rites their religion required after a great victory. The 3 eagles were carried away into the groves and displayed. Perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 Roman soldiers died across those 4 days. The exact figure is uncertain. The ancient sources give varying estimates, and the archaeological record, while confirming the scale, cannot be made to yield precise counts. But the order of magnitude has never been in question. An entire Roman army, something near a tenth of the empire's total military strength, ceased to exist in a wood. The news reached Rome, and the accounts of what it did to Augustus are among the most vivid passages in ancient literature. Suetonius, writing a century later, reports that the grief was extreme and prolonged, that the emperor let his beard and his hair grow for months, which was the most conspicuous physical expression of mourning available to a Roman man, a deliberate public unravelling of a person who had built his entire authority on composure, and that he would strike his head against a door and cry out for Quinctilius Varus to give him back his legions. The phrase has come down through 2,000 years with the peculiar quality of something that became true by being repeated, told and retold until it acquired the inevitability of a thing that simply must have been said. Whether Augustus used those exact words, or whether Suetonius was recording a tradition already polished by 100 years of telling, hardly matters now. The emotional content was accurate. This was the worst military disaster of his reign, possibly the worst single defeat Rome had suffered since Cannae, and it arrived at the precise moment when the German province had seemed almost finished. The immediate response was triage rather than vengeance. Tiberius, the best general available, was sent north with additional forces to hold the frontier and prevent what many in Rome expected to be an immediate invasion of Gaul. He accomplished it with his usual unspectacular competence, and no invasion came. Not because Arminius lacked ambition, because the coalition that had destroyed Varus was not a state and had none of a state's capacity to sustain a strategic offensive. It was an alliance assembled for one specific defensive purpose, and once that purpose was achieved, its members went home, back to their villages, their fields, their herds, and their long-running quarrels with each other. This was simultaneously the great strength and the absolute ceiling of Germanic warfare. It could produce extraordinary results under the exact conditions that favoured it, and it could not be converted into the sustained imperial project that turning a defensive victory into a conquest would have demanded. Arminius had built something magnificent that was, by its nature, designed to dissolve. Augustus, in the last years of his life, made no serious attempt to recover the lost province. He died 5 years after the Forest, and he appears to have concluded, with the hard, practical realism the disaster forced on him, that the country east of the Rhine was not worth what taking and holding it would cost. His final written instructions to his successors, preserved by Suetonius, included the advice to keep the empire within its existing boundaries. Later emperors disregarded that advice in Britain, and again in Dacia. In Germania it held. The Rhine, which had been intended as a staging ground for conquest, became instead the permanent eastern frontier of the empire in that region, and it remained so for as long as there was a Roman Empire to have a frontier. Arminius did not rest on what he had done. The 12 years between the Forest and his death were a sustained struggle on several fronts at once. Against the Roman counter-campaigns that Germanicus led into Germany, against rival Germanic leaders whose ambitions and allegiances shifted constantly, and against the internal divisions within his own tribe and the wider northern world that were the permanent political condition of a society without stable institutions. The succession of Tiberius in the year 14 was followed almost immediately by those campaigns. Partly this was strategy. Partly, as Tacitus suggests with a certain sharpness, it was because the legions on the Rhine were showing signs of mutinous discontent, and there is no cure for restless soldiers quite like giving them somewhere to march. Germanicus, adopted son of Tiberius and the most beloved figure in the Roman public imagination, led what was in many ways the most serious attempt Rome ever made to avenge the disaster and recover the lost ground. He was young, charismatic, descended from Drusus, who had died from that fall from his horse, and the crowds adored him in a way that made his adoptive father quietly uneasy. In the year 15 he found the battlefield. Leading his forces through the same country where Varus had been destroyed 6 years before, Germanicus came upon the remains of the camps. The outline of Varus's main camp was still legible in the earth, the ditch and ramparts softened but readable to soldiers who built such things themselves. Beyond it, the half-ruined wall of a smaller camp where survivors had made a final stand. And then, moving forward into the killing ground itself, the bones. Tacitus's description of what those soldiers found is one of the most haunting passages in Latin literature, and it deserves to be honoured in spirit rather than reproduced word for word. In the open ground, bleached bones lying scattered or in small heaps, according to whether men had died running or died standing. Near them, broken weapons and the skeletons of horses. On the tree trunks, skulls fixed in place. In the groves close by, the altars where the tribunes and the senior centurions had been sacrificed. And there were witnesses. Germanicus had men with him who had survived that week and escaped. They walked through the ground they had fled from, and they showed their commander where particular things had happened, where Varus had fallen, where the officers had been killed at the altars, where a man had last seen someone he knew. Germanicus ordered the remains buried. It was an act of piety toward the dead, and a political gesture toward the living, and some of his soldiers wept as they worked. Tiberius later criticized him for it. His adoptive father held that a commander should not weep over the dead, that it was corrosive to discipline, that an army needs its general to look forward and not down. But the gesture was made regardless, and the bones went into the earth that had already received them once in blood. It is worth saying plainly that nobody knows where that grave is. Germanicus raised a mound over it, and within a year the Germanic warriors had torn the mound down, and the ground closed over the whole thing again. 2,000 years of ploughing later, we are still finding them one at a time. The campaigns of those years produced one of the most extraordinary scenes in all of ancient historical writing. Tacitus preserves it in the Annals with the kind of specific dramatic detail that suggests it was recognized even at the time as one of those moments where the personal and the historical fall together with almost unbearable clarity. In the year 15, Roman forces advanced to the Weser and found Arminius and his coalition positioned along the eastern bank. On the western bank, with the Roman army, stood Flavus, the younger brother, the other Cherusci boy who had gone south all those years ago. He had served Rome faithfully since childhood, had stayed loyal when Arminius turned, and had spent his adult life in Roman auxiliary service. He had lost an eye somewhere along the way, in an engagement the sources do not trouble to name, and he wore the injury as men in that world wore such things, as a credential. Arminius called across the water. He wanted to speak to his brother. Germanicus permitted it. Perhaps he calculated that the conversation might yield intelligence. Perhaps he was simply moved by the human situation. Perhaps he was curious, as anyone would be, about what two brothers would find to say to each other with a river between them and armies at their backs. What Tacitus records has the quality of a compressed tragedy. Two men who had made irreconcilable choices, laying out their arguments in the formal shapes of rhetoric, and carrying beneath the formality the entire weight of a bond, broken by the deepest political difference it is possible for two people to have. Flavus spoke first. He spoke of his service and its rewards, the pay, the decorations, the promotion, the regard of the commanders he had served under. He spoke of what Rome had brought to the Germanic peoples who accepted its protection, law, markets, peace, and he urged his brother to submit, while submission was still something that could be offered rather than imposed. Arminius answered that the sacred duty of a man to his homeland, to the freedom of his ancestors, to the gods of his fathers, was worth more than anything Rome had to give. That the men who followed Rome were slaves by any meaningful definition, whatever titles they were permitted to hold. That Flavus had sold his liberty for a pension and some metal from a foreign power, and that the eye he had lost in Roman service was a truer emblem of what Roman patronage costs than any decoration could ever be of what it pays. The argument grew hot. Flavus called for a horse and weapons so that he could cross the river and settle it personally, and Roman officers had to physically hold him back. On the far bank, Arminius's men were forming up, and Arminius was shouting challenges across the water in Latin. In Latin. The language of his childhood in a foreign city, the language he had learned so thoroughly that it came out of him first when he was furious, ahead of the tongue he had been born to. Then the Roman cavalry came up, and the confrontation broke off, and the two men never spoke again. The scene survived in the historical tradition because it was too perfect to lose. Two brothers on opposite banks, each loyal to something real, each convinced the other had betrayed the only thing that mattered, separated by moving water and by choices that could not be taken back. But look at it a moment longer, because it is also a scene about what Arminius actually was. A man who still reached for Latin in a rage. A man who measured his brother's choice against a standard of ancestral liberty that Rome's own philosophical tradition had articulated, and that he had absorbed, along with the very language he needed to articulate it in. He used Roman categories to argue against Rome. He used Rome's own words to insist that what Rome offered was not worth having. The irony is not incidental, it is the tragedy itself. The campaigns Germanicus conducted were genuine engagements of real weight, not punitive raids. He defeated Arminius several times. The battle at Idistaviso in the year 16, fought on open ground near the Weser, was the most significant Roman victory of the war, precisely because the open terrain restored to the legions everything the forest had taken away. Arminius was wounded there, and his coalition was temporarily broken. 2 of the 3 eagles came home in those years. Significant damage was inflicted on the Cherusci and their allies. But Arminius was neither captured nor killed, and for all their tactical success, the campaigns were not achieving the strategic objective of restoring Roman authority east of the river. The logistics were crushing, and in the summer of 16, the fleet supplying the campaign was caught by a catastrophic storm in the North Sea that destroyed many ships and drowned large numbers of men. Tacitus describes soldiers washed onto unknown shores and onto islands, some rescued by tribes who had every reason not to bother. It was a reminder that the northern world had ways of defeating Roman power that no amount of victory in pitched battle could address. The forest was one. The weather was another. Tiberius recalled Germanicus in that same year, deciding that honour had been satisfied. The eagles were recovered, or 2 of them were. Arminius had been beaten in the field, and further campaigns to subjugate the territory would cost more than the territory was worth. It was the identical conclusion Augustus had reached after the disaster, arrived at independently by a different man for the same reasons, and this time it proved permanent. Germanicus went home to a triumph and to an early death that Rome never stopped whispering about. The Rhine remained the frontier, Germany remained German. The most painful episode of those years, from Arminius's own side of the river, was the loss of his wife. Thusnelda was captured in the year 15. She was pregnant, and she was living with her father, Segestes, who had by then gone over openly to the Romans. It was Segestes himself who handed her to them. Tacitus describes the reaction of Arminius with a single word: frenzy. He reports that the man rode through Cherusci territory calling for war against Segestes and against Rome, that the seizure of his wife drove him into a rage beyond even his usual intensity of purpose. And then Tacitus, who was rarely at a loss for language, more or less stops. The sources record the grief without ever finding words adequate to it. He never saw her again. She was taken to Rome and walked in Germanicus's triumph in the year 17, in chains, beside her young son Thumelicus, who had been born in captivity and had never seen the country he came from. Tacitus notes that she did not weep and did not beg, and that she walked with her eyes down, which the Roman crowd found unsettling in a way it could not quite name. The boy grew up in Rome. He was trained as a gladiator, and then he simply disappears from the historical record before his story reaches any kind of resolution, which is its own quiet cruelty. Arminius never remarried. The later years carried the contradiction that had always been latent in his position. He had achieved the great victory that made him the most powerful figure in the Germanic world, and that power was, slowly, destroying him. The tribes that had fought together in the forest had their own ambitions and their own jealousies. The man who had organized their greatest collective success now found himself the object of their collective suspicion about what he might do with the authority that success had handed him. There was conflict with Maroboduus, king of the Marcomanni, who controlled the country of modern Bohemia and represented the most serious alternative centre of Germanic power. Maroboduus had not joined the ambush. He had stayed neutral, which Arminius found galling while he was assembling the coalition, and which Maroboduus found merely prudent, given how carefully he had cultivated his relationship with Rome. Afterward, Arminius tried to recruit him into a broader alliance against the empire. Maroboduus declined. The relationship deteriorated into open war, and in the fighting that followed, Maroboduus was eventually driven out of his kingdom, pushed partly by Arminius's military pressure and partly by opposition among his own nobles. He ended his days as a pensioner of Rome at Ravenna, living quietly on an imperial allowance for 18 years, which is a symmetry that would surely have amused Arminius, given how hard the man had worked to stay on Rome's good side. But removing him did not stabilize anything. The Germanic world was constitutively hostile to the kind of centralized authority that the victory had placed within Arminius's reach. The same assembly culture that had allowed the coalition to form in the first place, the requirement of noble consent, the deep tradition of warriors who chose their leaders rather than inheriting subjection to them, made it impossible to consolidate that coalition into anything lasting. The very qualities that made the victory possible made the victory unusable. That is the shape of his whole life, if you stand far enough back. Other Cherusci nobles watched him accumulating influence and saw a threat to themselves, and the Romans watched from the far bank and offered support to anyone willing to oppose him, which was a tempting offer, because Roman patronage meant resources and protection that no purely Germanic arrangement could match. Tacitus reports that the Chatti, one of the major tribes, sent a letter to the Roman Senate offering to poison Arminius if Rome would supply the poison. The Senate's reply is one of the more dignified moments in the history of Roman diplomacy. It was not by secret treachery, the answer came back, but openly and by force of arms that the Roman people took vengeance on their enemies. Rome would not stoop to poisoning a man it could not beat in the field. There is a formula in that answer, certainly, but there is also, if you listen, something like genuine feeling. The Romans respected Arminius even while they hated him. They recognized in him a quality of courage and intelligence that deserved open warfare rather than a cup of something in the dark. It is a strange compliment, and it was meant. The end, when it came, was not Roman. In the year 21, Arminius was killed by members of his own extended family and political circle. His kinsman, Tacitus says, who had concluded that his growing power and his apparent reach toward kingship were dangers outweighing whatever it would cost to remove him. He was 37, or perhaps 38. He had spent roughly a third of his life as a Roman officer, and the remaining 2/3 as a Germanic chieftain, and he had managed to be genuinely extraordinary in both capacities, which almost nobody in history has done. The man who defeated Varus was never defeated by Rome. He was defeated by the structural limits of the society he was trying to lead. A tribal world that prized individual freedom and the autonomy of its chiefs so completely that it could not accommodate the concentration of power that turning a military victory into a political settlement would have required. Tacitus wrote his epitaph with a compression that gives it the weight of a permanent verdict. The liberator of Germany, he called him, without doubt. Praise from an enemy's historian carries a specific authority. Tacitus had no reason to say it, every professional and patriotic reason not to, and he said it anyway, because it was true, and he was the kind of writer who could not leave a true thing unsaid. The physical evidence of the battle spent nearly 2,000 years underground, in fields that were ploughed and reploughed, under forests that grew and were felled and grew again, in ground that shifted through flood and erosion and all the slow geological patience that buries the past without malice. The location was argued over for centuries. German scholars and patriots proposed sites scattered across a wide stretch of the north, partly on the basis of ancient sources that were never precise enough to fix a place, and partly on the basis of local traditions that were usually more romantic than reliable. Nearly every district with a hill and a legend put in a claim. The breakthrough came in 1987, and it did not come from a university. A British amateur archaeologist named Tony Clun, a retired army major stationed near Osnabrück, who had developed a hobbyist interest in local history, was walking fields near the village of Calcresa with a metal detector. He had done his reading. He had a theory about where Roman material ought to be, and he had permission from the farmers, and he had the particular patience of a man who enjoys a slow afternoon outdoors. He found Roman coins. Then he found more Roman coins. Then he found lead sling bullets of the specific type carried by Roman auxiliary troops, which do not turn up in a field for casual reasons. He brought his finds to the professionals at Osnabrück, who understood immediately what they were looking at, and systematic excavation began. What emerged from that ground over the following decades is one of the most remarkable battlefield assemblages in the history of European archaeology. Roughly 5,000 to 6,000 Roman military artifacts spread across an area of some 50 square kilometers, but concentrated tightly in a narrow corridor between the Vian hills and what had once been a marsh. Swords and daggers, spear points and arrowheads, lead sling bullets, fragments of armor and helmets, cavalry fittings, coins whose dates cluster in exactly the right decade and stop. And then the small things, which are the ones that undo you. Keys, razors, scale weights, finger rings that men had been wearing when they died. Somebody carried a key into that forest. Somewhere behind him, in a fort along the Lippe, there was a box it opened, and he expected to open it again. Human bones as well, many of them bearing the marks of edged weapons. And along the high ground above the corridor, the remains of an earthwork rampart, exactly the kind of prepared ambush position the ancient sources had described, in exactly the place the ancient sources implied. The distribution of the finds along that corridor maps precisely onto the account of an army destroyed while strung out on the march. This has been confirmed by spatial analysis and by careful excavation of the contexts in which objects were found, which is the unglamorous work that turns a scatter of metal into a story. Among the most affecting single objects is a decorated Roman face mask. It is the front plate of a cavalry parade helmet, the kind worn during ceremonial exercises rather than in combat, and it was found in a condition suggesting it had been deliberately displayed or set down, rather than simply dropped in the fighting, perhaps taken as a trophy, kept a while, and then laid aside. It sits now in the museum at Calcresa, and it has become the emblem of the whole site. A face without a face, blank-eyed and calm and entirely empty, looking out at the people who come to try to understand what happened in that field. The landscape there has been partially reconstructed. A section of the earthwork has been rebuilt to its approximate ancient dimensions so that a visitor can walk along the ridge and look down the slope toward the narrow corridor where the column would have moved, and grasp, in the body rather than in the head, what the trapped men saw when the warriors appeared above them. The museum itself, designed with the building embedded in the landscape rather than imposed on it, is among the more thoughtful archaeological museums in Europe. It treats its evidence seriously, and it maintains an appropriate humility about the things it cannot establish, while remaining confident about the outline. That humility has been tested. Recent geoarchaeological work has raised real questions about the dating of certain structures at the site, suggesting that what was long taken for the Germanic palisade may in fact be medieval. Historians and archaeologists still debate it, and the debate is healthy. But it complicates the picture without overturning it. The Roman finds are undeniable. The dating of the coins correlates with the right legions. The landscape fits the description. Calcresa is somewhere that something devastating happened to a Roman army moving through a narrow corridor between hills and a marsh. And the most likely candidate for what that was remains the battle of the year 9. The legacy of Arminius across the 2,000 years since has been a mirror. Successive generations have looked into it and seen, with remarkable consistency, whatever they arrived wanting to see. The freedom fighter, the nationalist hero, the barbarian liberator, the founding father of a country that would not exist for 18 centuries. And in the 20th century, a dangerous precedent for ethnic nationalism whose story had to be handled carefully or set down entirely. The immediate Roman legacy was specific and institutional, 3 legionary numbers never used again, the Rhine as permanent frontier, an army whose strength was never rebuilt to its previous level, and a fundamental revision of the empire's strategic ambitions in northern Europe that outlasted every emperor who might have reversed it. Tacitus's Annals, which give us most of what we know about the campaigns of Germanicus and the last years of Arminius, were written roughly a century afterward, with the particular clarity that comes from knowing how things turned out. And Tacitus is consistently warmer toward Arminius than Roman propriety would seem to require. He admired military skill and personal courage wherever he found them, and he found them in Arminius more abundantly than in a good many Roman commanders of his own acquaintance. The medieval world largely lost him. His name survived in chronicles and in the transmission of Tacitus and Velleius, copied by monks who had no particular interest in the man. But he was not a figure of broad cultural resonance in a Europe organized around Christian theology and the inheritance of Rome, rather than around a classical Germanic past. For 1,000 years, he was simply a name in a manuscript that almost nobody read. The rediscovery of Tacitus's Germania in 1425, a manuscript found in a German monastery, began the long process of recovering that past as a source of identity. But Arminius himself did not become a major figure until the early 16th century, when the humanist scholar Ulrich von Hutten wrote a dialogue casting him as a defender of Germanic freedom against Roman tyranny, at a moment when a great many people in German-speaking lands were newly interested in the idea of resisting authority that came from the south. And when Martin Luther, who may have been the first to render the name as Hermann, celebrated him as a national hero, the trajectory was set. The line from Luther's celebration to the Hermannsdenkmal, the colossal bronze figure completed in 1875 on a wooded hill near Detmold, runs directly through the entire complicated history of German nationalism. The monument was begun in 1838 by the sculptor Ernst von Bandel in the early flowering of the nationalist movement that would eventually produce unification. It took nearly 40 years, and von Bandel spent much of his life on it, and for long stretches the money simply was not there, and the unfinished figure stood on its hill, waiting. It was completed at last in 1875, 4 years after unification under Prussian leadership, and fresh from victory over France. The statue shows him with a sword raised above his head in a gesture of triumph and defiance. It stands 53 meters tall, including its pedestal, the largest statue in Germany. And at its base, inscriptions connect the ancient victory over Rome to the contemporary victory over France, collapsing 18 centuries into a single, unbroken narrative of national assertion against foreign domination. The appropriation is, in retrospect, historically incoherent in several important ways. Arminius was a Cherusci. He was not German in any ethnic or national sense the 19th century would have recognized, because German national identity was itself the product of centuries of development that could not possibly have been predicted from the tribal particularism of his own time. He would not have understood the word. He would not have understood the question. His victory did not produce a unified Germanic state. It produced continued tribal warfare and political fragmentation, and the peoples he freed from Roman rule went on to fight each other with the same ferocity they had shown in the forest. And the absence of Roman provincial organization meant that the country between the rivers developed without the roads, the cities, the legal systems, and the written culture that tend to accelerate the growth of the social complexity from which nation-states eventually emerge. Arminius, as the founder of Germany, is a myth of the 19th century, not a judgment of history. The Nazi period made the appropriation worse, as it made the appropriation of nearly everything in German cultural heritage worse. Hitler visited the monument in 1926 for campaign speeches. Party formations and youth organizations held rallies at its base. The figure of the eternal Germanic warrior resisting foreign domination was pressed into service for purposes whose violence and whose racial ideology would have been entirely unrecognizable to a chieftain who was fighting a specific resistance against a specific occupying power, and who was not enacting anybody's destiny. After 1945, he receded from German public culture in a way that parallels the broader retreat from nationalist mythology that the experience of those years made necessary. The monument remained. You can visit it today, and most of the people who make the climb are more interested in the view across the hills than in anything the inscriptions say. But the figure of Arminius as national hero became uncomfortable, permanently shadowed by the uses his story had been put to. East German culture attempted a partial rehabilitation, reading him as a champion of the people against imperial exploitation, in terms that a Marxist historiography found more congenial. Neither reading is adequate. He was neither a racial hero nor a class warrior. He was a man of unusual intelligence in an unusual position, who made one extraordinary choice and paid, in the end, the full price for the ambitions that choice created in him. It is worth considering, too, what happened to his memory in Rome across the centuries between the battle and the fall of the Western Empire, because the Roman response is revealing about what the defeat actually meant to the civilization that suffered it. The immediate reaction was grief and resolve. The uncut hair, the head against the door, the emergency deployment north, and then a carefully managed public narrative emphasizing the treachery of a man who had been trusted rather than any systemic failure of policy. The fault is Varus's. The empire remains supreme. The frontier will be held. That line was politically necessary and psychologically understandable, and it was also less than fully honest. Rome had not been defeated by one man's treachery. Rome had been defeated by a systematic failure to understand the limits of what imperial administration could accomplish in a particular kind of country against a particular kind of resistance. Varus became the scapegoat for a mistake that the entire Augustan conception of German expansion had been building toward for 20 years. The Roman writers who dealt with Arminius each managed their ambivalence differently. Velleius, who had met him, is angry and hurt in the specific way that betrayal by an acquaintance produces. He calls him deceitful and cunning in the same passage where he acknowledges his intelligence and ability. The praise and the condemnation almost simultaneous, the way you might speak of someone who genuinely impressed you and then genuinely wronged you, and you have never worked out how to hold both. Tacitus, writing 3 generations later with the detachment that distance provides, is the most nuanced. He presents him as a genuine hero, acknowledges the liberator's role explicitly, and delivers the epitaph that has lasted because it was accurate. And the later tradition never found a comfortable place to put him. He was an enemy who had beaten Rome, and not at a moment of weakness or exceptional strain, but at the height of imperial confidence, against well-supplied and experienced forces under a respected commander. He had used Rome's own training against Rome, and he had won, and it had stuck. That was harder to digest than the standard story of barbarian resistance eventually overcome, because it never was overcome. Rome never recovered Germany. The province Augustus had been building simply ceased to exist as a possibility, and the frontier that Arminius defended remained the edge of the Roman world in that direction for the rest of Roman history. Whether what replaced Roman rule was better or worse for the people who lived under it, across the next several centuries of tribal warfare and migration and eventual conversion and the slow formation of a medieval German world, is a question without a simple answer, and one that Arminius himself could not possibly have foreseen. What he achieved was specific, real, and consequential. He stopped Rome. He stopped the Romanization of the northern lands. He made Germany German. And here is the single most vivid measure of what that meant, and it is closer to you than you might expect. It is the language you are listening to right now. English is a Germanic language, so is German, so are Dutch, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, Icelandic. Together, the Germanic family covers the native speech of perhaps 600 million people, including the working language of international science and commerce that English became in the 20th century. That entire family exists because the country in which those languages developed was never Romanized. Because Latin, the medium of Roman provincial life, never took permanent root east of the Rhine, except in the southernmost margins. The Romance languages, French and Spanish and Italian and Portuguese and Romanian, are Latin's daughters, the product of Roman provincial culture persisting through centuries and slowly separating into distinct tongues. And look where they live, west of the Rhine, south of the Danube, exactly the territories Rome successfully absorbed, east of the Rhine, Germanic. The line between Romance and Germanic Europe today, running roughly from the mouth of the Rhine through Belgium, through Switzerland, and down into northern Italy, corresponds with remarkable precision to the frontier Rome settled on after the forest. This is not coincidence. It is the direct, traceable, linguistic consequence of 4 rainy days in the year 9. Every English sentence ever spoken, every German philosophical treatise ever written, every Dutch painting ever titled, every Scandinavian saga ever composed, carries inside it, embedded in the very medium of its expression, the consequence of what one man decided in a wood. When you say the word father, you are using a Germanic word. Mother, water, land, house, hand. These are not borrowings from Latin. They are the direct inheritance of a language that survived because it was never overwritten, growing from the same root system that Arminius defended. The counterfactual is simple to state. Had those legions lived, the Rhine would not have become the permanent boundary. The land between the rivers would have been absorbed and Romanized much as Gaul was, and it would have grown a Latin-derived language and a Roman institutional framework. And that would have been the foundation of a very different medieval and modern country. From there, the chain is long but followable. A Romanized Germany develops as a Romance culture, not a Germanic one, and the northern languages are displaced or never appear. The medieval politics of Central Europe, built around the successor kingdoms of the Germanic migrations, unfold differently in the absence of a Germanic cultural identity, capable of resisting first Roman and later Frankish dominance. The Reformation, which drew so heavily on German particularism and on the printing culture of German-speaking cities, takes another shape, or perhaps does not happen at all. And the whole long sequence that produced modern Germany unfolds differently, if it unfolds. None of which means the other world would have been worse. A Romanized Germany might well have been a more comfortable place to live for most of the people in it, much as Gaul in the 2nd century was probably a better place to be than Gaul in the 1st century before. Romanization was carried out with real violence and real cultural destruction, and it also brought roads and literacy and towns and legal systems and commercial integration that generated genuine prosperity. Whether the Germanic world that emerged from the absence of all that was, on balance, better or worse for the people who lived in it is a question no honest historian can answer. What can be said is that the world which emerged from that forest is the world that actually happened. and that the existence of a distinct northern cultural tradition, its languages, its old assemblies, its particular values around personal freedom and warrior honor and communal decision, still faintly legible in Northern Europe today, runs in a direct causal line back to one man's decision in one narrow place. The man himself was dead at 37, killed by his own kinsmen, his wife and his son, in Roman hands. The coalition he had built was dissolved by the same centrifugal forces of tribal independence he had never managed to overcome. He used everything Rome gave him against Rome, and he won. And he could not use what he had won to build anything that outlived him. For 2,000 years, the battle and the man have been drifting apart. The battle carries all the consequential weight. The man has been slowly disappearing into the mythologies the battle attracted. But he was not a myth. He was born in a forest and raised in a city of marble. He was taught to fight in the Roman way, and he turned around and used it for the forest. He had a wife he loved, and a brother who chose the other bank, and a father-in-law who betrayed him, and kinsmen who killed him. He lived his entire adult life between two worlds, and never fully belonged to either one. And that displacement, that condition of being the insider who understood the institution well enough to break it, was the one thing that made everything else possible. He knew exactly how to make Rome defeat itself. The forest is still there. The hills above Calcresa still rise above the flat land. The corridor between the slope and the old marsh is still narrow, and somewhere in that soil, beneath the fields Tony Clun walked with his metal detector on those quiet afternoons, there are still Roman soldiers who have not been found, lying where they fell, waiting without impatience for someone to bring them up into the light. The night has settled fully around you now, and the story of the man between worlds has reached its end. Not the end of its consequences, which are still unfolding in the shape of the words you speak and the culture that made you, but the end of the man himself, gone at 37 in a quarrel among his own people, with the empire he had beaten still watching from the far side of the water, the legions that never came back, the eagles that took decades to come home, and one of them 32 years. The road that was never finished, the province that was never organised, the language that was never spoken in a place where German is spoken now. The river is still there. The Rhine still runs its old course between one world and the other, and it runs quietly, and it has run that way for a very long time. The bones are still being lifted from the ground at Calcresa, one at a time, as the ploughs and the archaeologists work slowly through the soil. The blank face of the mask is in its case in the museum, looking calmly out at nothing. And somewhere in the dark of that forest, the warriors who spent those long weeks in position, waiting for a column to appear on the track below them, are home now. 20 centuries home. The trees have grown over everything they built. The rampart is gone. The sacred groves are gone. The eagles are in museums. The man who arranged it all has been 2,000 years asleep. And Germany is German. Rest easy now. Let the forest close softly behind you. There is nothing left to decide, and nothing left to carry, and the story will keep without you. Sweet dreams.